Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the University of South Carolina, Lancaster's W. Brent Bergen Lunch and Learn lecture series. Obviously, this is the last one that we will have in 2022. And before I introduce our speaker for today, let me tell you about our first one in January. Cynthia Curtis, who is a University of South Carolina Lancaster undergraduate, will be given a presentation entitled "The Sleeping Woman Speaks: Memory and Voice of the Women of Gazapa Volcano, El Salvador." And that is a PURE grant. That's a grant through Palmetto College that she's been working on. And we learned this morning she got a Magellan grant and is on her way to El Salvador in May of 23 to continue the project. Today, I am absolutely delighted to have Woody Holton, Dr. Woody Holton from USC History Department down in Columbia, to be our speaker. He is the author of a lot of books. The first one I'm going to tell you about is Liberty is Sweet: The Hidden History of the American Revolution, which published in 2021. He wrote a book called Abigail Adams, which wrote through a Guggenheim Fellowship, and won the Bancroft Prize. He's also the author of Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution, which was a finalist for the National Book Award. His first book, Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia, won several awards. And my colleague, Dr. Evan Noe here, who's a historian, said, everyone reads that book in graduate school in my field. And it's obvious because his books are required reading apparently on more than 200 college campuses across the country, and they've been translated into German and Arabic. So without further ado, Professor Woody Holton, Indigenous People and the American War of Independence. Woody, welcome.
Thank you so much, Chris. And I'm really thrilled to be with you. Those of you who are there in person, I'm sorry I couldn't make it in person. I've had a death in the family, and I'm in Lancaster County, Virginia, not Lancaster, South Carolina, and I'm on the lands of the Powhatan Confederation. That's Pocahontas's people, many of whom are still very much around. In fact, some of my school friends when I was going to school in Richmond were descendants of the Powhatan Confederacy. And so that's one reason to be happy to be back in Virginia, where I'm originally from. I am not a specialist in Native American studies, so you may wonder what I'm doing here. And I hope you'll see my talk here as an homage to those of you who are in this field, because I've become convinced that you need to do American Indian history if you're going to successfully do American Revolution history. That's my specialty, the American Revolution. And from my first book in 1999 to the most recent last year, I have really been struck by you can't do the traditional history of people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson unless you are also studying Native Americans because of their enormous influence on the traditional kind of history. And part of this homage that I want to pay to those of you who study this field is to embarrass myself a little bit by putting up a map from my first book, Forced Founders. And, you know, to my credit as a person writing about people like Washington and Jefferson, at least I had Native Americans on the map. But look what I did. The same thing that most other historians at the time were doing was sort of writing Cherokee out there somewhere between the Tennessee and the Savannah rivers and the Miami Confederacy and so forth. And notice the one compromise I remember making with the map maker, he initially sent me the map back with Williamsburg and Charleston, but no native cities. And I said, well, if we can't have native towns, at least get rid of the colonial towns as well. But I make this confession about my 1999 book, mostly, frankly, to brag about how much better I think I did. Still not perfect. If you notice, for instance, the Petite Nation at the mouth of the Mississippi are not in the map that ran as the frontispiece of my most recent book called Liberty is Sweet. But at least I acknowledged, as we should if we want to tell the truth, that there were native boundaries. Yes, they were often contested. For instance, Kentucky was known as the dark and bloody ground before whites even showed up to contest it, but it was ground between hunting ground disputed between nations north and south of the Ohio River. So yes, there were disputed territories, but of course there were disputed territories among white Europeans and Africans as well. And the other thing about this town, I certainly don't have this map certainly don't have every native town any more than I have every colonial town, but I still do have a bunch of both of them. So that to me is progress in 20 years, although I'm the first to acknowledge there's a lot more progress to make. One other piece of progress I can thank a USC undergraduate for. I may have to zoom into that talk from El Salvador, Chris, but I also have many wonderful students. One in particular did the population table for my new book, and it's the part of the book that I'm proudest of, even though all I did was oversee her work. But you see, we have not only the native, white, and African-American population of all of the 13 colonies that rebelled, but also the 13 other British colonies that did not rebel, and the French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, but most significantly for what we're doing right now, the major native nations east of the Mississippi River was the most I could do. And you can kind of see the theme of my work is to get everybody almost literally, in this case, on the same page, at least on facing pages. So I'm certainly not the first person to report these population figures. And in fact, I'm just taking them from the sources indicated on the right. But to get everybody on the same map, in the same population, because they really were part of the same story. And I can't resist thanking my student, Riley Sutherland, who I never would have done this population table because I was too aware of the problems, but she didn't know it couldn't be done. And lots of aspects of my book have been challenged, but not Riley's part of it. So let me move into talking about the revolution. And I want to talk first about its origins and Natives' impact on that, and then on the war itself, and then a little bit about the aftermath. And many of you know what that blue line is along the crest of the Appalachian Mountains. That's the Proclamation of 1763, which is in all the textbooks, but a lot of historians dismiss it and say it's not a grievance. That is, the colonists were not mad that the British drew this line saying, we don't want anybody to settle west of this line in order to try to prevent natives from attacking. We want you to keep east of this line. But historians say, well, it's not like a Great Wall of China where people could just slip across that line and go settle out there on the prairie and build their little houses on the prairie like Michael Landon. But here's the difference. If you're an actual settler, you can cross that line. But the people that I'm really interested in are the people like Washington and Jefferson, who were land speculators. And just as you can't sell me your car and until you can hand over the title, the people who wanted to obtain land west of that blue line for speculation couldn't do so because they couldn't get title to it. So I would say that the Proclamation line of 1763 was a big grievance mentioned in the Declaration of Independence on the part of land speculators, even if it was less of a grievance for actual settlers. And just to talk about what intense grievance that was, here's George Washington saying, now he got most of his wealth by marrying it, married a rich widow, as did Jefferson and Franklin and many other, Madison. But he wanted to expand that wealth. He said the greatest estates came from taking up those rich back lands, that is Native American land. And the Proclamation line of 1763 really shut him and other land speculators down. And Washington was really the king of this. There was one guy interviewed in the 19th century saying, oh yeah, my great-grandfather, he was a big land speculator. In fact, he was as great a landmonger as General Washington. So George Washington was the gold standard by which these other gold grubbers, that is, people trying to make their wealth through land speculation, he was the standard by which everybody else was judged. So I think we can all agree that one way that Native Americans influenced the coming on of the American Revolution was simply by defending their land especially in Pontiac's Rebellion in 1763, which led the British government to draw that blue line that I showed you, the proclamation line, angering people like colonists like Washington and Jefferson. Now, they weren't angry only at having their westward expansion inhibited. They were also inhibited by taxes like the Stamp Act. And I want to talk about those too, because while I was researching my most recent book, I did something I should have done 30 years ago, which is I finally sat down and read these taxes, especially the first one, the first major British tax on the colonists called the Stamp Act, because I had been lecturing to my students just what the textbooks all say. Oh yeah, the purpose of the Stamp Act was to pay off Britain's debt from this war that ended in 1763 that nearly doubled the British debt. And that's not what it's there for at all. The Stamp Act is very clear in saying the purpose of this money is to leave 10,000 British troops in America after that war ended in 1763. They had left 10,000 troops there, something they'd never done before. Britain had sent troops all over the world to fight, but they'd always brought them home after the war. But this time, Britain left troops behind, and you can see them on the same map. Can everybody see those red rectangles here? I'll indicate some of them. There's a bunch in New York, out at Fort Niagara. They put Detroit on the wrong side of the straits there, but there's Detroit. They have them as far out as Fort Sharp on the Mississippi River. The big ones are regiments, the small ones are companies, and these are the bulk of those 10,000 troops that got left there. They are there, I want to call them peacekeeping troops, because they are there to enforce this line, to protect the colonists from Native Americans, but also to protect Native Americans from the colonists. And I really need to emphasize that those troops aren't protecting indigenous people out of any sympathy from them, but as a purely practical matter that we don't want to go to war against these people anymore. And so, well, as the Annual Register put it, those troops were there, and I'll quote, to awe and protect the Indians. I really like that line. They are there to awe the Indians, that is, keep them in awe, keep them from attacking the colonists, but also to protect the Indians from the colonists. So therefore, I think it's fair to say that what the British government was doing was building a wall on the western border of its colonies in America. And the British, this was a human wall of troops to enforce the proclamation line. And the British said, hey, we're going to build this wall on the border. Let's make the colonists pay for it. And that was the Stamp Act. So this is the one thing that everybody knows. If I started the phrase, no taxation, most of you, all of you could finish it, no taxation without representation. And so it's a very traditional story of the American Revolution, the Stamp Act. And it would not have been adopted if Native Americans had not fought back against colonists, defending their land in that war that ended in 1763, and then in the so-called Pontiac's Rebellion of 1763. That's all. Those are the reasons why the British left those troops in America, and it was to pay for those troops that the Stamp Act was adopted. And you can see my theme here that you really can't understand why the American Revolution happened unless you're attentive to what natives were up to. Well, let's follow this story a little further forward. 6 years later, the House of Burgesses, including Washington and Jefferson and Patrick Henry, all land speculators, all members of that House of Burgesses, unanimously sent a petition to the British government in 1769 saying, hey, we've used up all the land east of the proclamation line. You got to let us tear down that blue line and let us go west of the proclamation line. And one of the most amazing discoveries I ever made was that in deciding what to do with this petition from Washington, Jefferson, and the rest, the British government was influenced by what Native women were doing, specifically at that Blue Star that's on the Wabash River. And we refer to the nations out there as the Miami Confederacy. And among this group, to use the language that whites use, there were 4 kinds of chiefs: male war chiefs and male peace chiefs, but also female war chiefs who helped decide, for instance, whether to go to war, and female peace chiefs who helped govern the town during peacetime. And this fourth category, the female peace chiefs out there on the Wabash River in 1769 sent wampum belts to their counterparts east of them, the Shawnees and the Delawares and other upper Ohio Indians, saying, we've had some differences lately, but let's bury our differences and let's reunite in order to collectively resist the British colonists from taking our land. And that really caught fire. And the most amazing thing that effort to build a big Native coalition, the most amazing thing about it was that it expanded to, this is the Ohio River, states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois are north of it, and Kentucky and on south to Tennessee and so forth are south of the Ohio. And the Ohio was a real border in the 1760s because many of the nations south of the river, like the Cherokees, were at war with the nations north of the river, like the Shawnees. But starting in 1769, these Native enemies were trying to form a coalition with each other to resist encroachment on their land. And they had some very interesting ways of going about that. I noticed that they tended to meet during the green corn ceremony or busk in August when they're picking, they've harvested the corn. And that was a religious ceremony that was shared among all these nations, even though they'd been enemies of each other. So you could see they're saying, well, let's look at what we have in common. We are all big practitioners of the green corn ceremony. And that was a religious kind of glue for this coalition. And there also appears to have been a racial glue. And I'm using that word race on purpose. It's a fiction, of course, that we normally think of Europeans as being the ones who've invented. But Native Americans helped invent it too. So at least according to our white sources, when the Native American diplomats putting together this coalition met, several people made statements to the effect of, and I'm quoting from memory, "Be always united, you who are of one color." And so, of course, before Columbus, Native Americans didn't think of themselves as Indians. They didn't think of themselves as alike in any way. So you had your friends and you had your enemies, but and they didn't think in terms of color either. But now here they are helping create the notion of color, because if they can think of themselves as the red people, of which they sometimes refer to themselves by this time, and in fact, one scholar even thinks the whole idea of Native Americans as red comes from Native people. But if they can think of themselves as the red race against the white race, that's a way for Cherokees and Shawnees to forget their past differences and unite. Well, all of this is a long way of saying the British, when they received that petition from Jefferson and Washington and the other land speculators saying, let us continue our westward expansion, the British also found out about what these Native women and men were doing to organize a coalition. The British didn't want to go to war against the Indians again. And so they said no to Jefferson and Washington in order to be able to say yes to these Native diplomats. And so it's another example of Natives influencing the British government's policy in a way that was really infuriating to land speculators like Jefferson and Washington. And in fact, that blue line on there, the proclamation line of 1763, was never repealed, and it still gets cited in law in Canada, which, as you know, broke off from Britain in a more peaceful way later on and kept a lot of British law. So now let's move on into the war itself. We've seen Native Americans helping, they weren't trying to stir things up between the British and the colonists, but that was the effect of their actions, whether it's the proclamation line or the Stamp Act or other things we could talk about. But now we're into the war, and here's Benedict Arnold, back when he was still batting for the American team, proposed to George Washington, the commander-in-chief on the American side in 1775, hey, why don't I take a bunch of our soldiers from Massachusetts and go up the Kennebec River, still part of Massachusetts in those days, and then over the mountains and attack Quebec. And this, maybe we can make Canada the 14th colony. And Washington signed off on that idea, but also gave Benedict Arnold an extra mission for the American cause, and that was to kill a man named Natanis, who was an Abenaki warrior whom Washington and Arnold had heard was a big supporter of the British cause. So off they set off on that amazing expedition up the Kennebec, and then its branch called the Dead River, which is anything but dead, class 5 rapids, as we put it today. And they came to this point in their going up the river. And it's the classic fork in the road. They didn't know which fork to take. But then one of Arnold's men made an amazing discovery. There was a stick. I don't know if you can see me at the corner of the screen, but anyway, there was a stick in the mud, and there was a little slit in the top of the stick. And in the slit was not a piece of paper, but a piece of birch bark. And on the piece of birch bark was a map of those two rivers that you're looking at right there, saying Quebec that way. If you want to get to Quebec, this is the right way to go. And so for a reason I've never quite understood, Arnold believed that this map maker was not trying to fool him, and followed that rightward course. And that turned out to be the correct course, and that got him to Quebec, where they got clobbered. Another story for another day. But does anybody want to guess who had left that map that really set Arnold on the correct course? Well, it was Natanis, that Abenaki warrior, who turned out actually to, at this point at least, be sympathetic to the American side. And he was showing that his alliance by helping them along. And he had been watching Arnold's army that whole time, as he later revealed to him. And so here's, I open with this story about the war because it shows the complexity. So many native nations trying to stay neutral, some able to stay that way, more pulled into the war, some switching sides, some pulling the British to try to help them, and so forth. But here's Natanis, who Arnold thinks is against him, is actually for him. And by the way, Arnold had another man, an Abenaki man, who he used to send messages back to Washington. But all of those messages were actually delivered straight to a British officer, because that man was the opposite of Natanis. He was sympathetic to the British side, all of which I think just goes to show the complexity. But I can't resist mentioning a couple of other examples, because I think we tend to generalize and say that most indigenous people fought for the British and more fought for the British side than the Americans. But we really should see that this was a Native American civil war, as well as an African-American civil war, as well as a civil war among whites. And Daniel Nimham was the head of the, Chief Sachem, as this plaque says, of the Wappinger Indians, who had allied with white farmers in the Hudson Valley. They were getting pushed off their land by people who claimed to be their landlords, the manor lords of the Hudson Valley. The Wappingers really were the ones who owned that land. And they also understood where they were in the colonial order. And so they offered these same white farmers, hey, if you'll acknowledge that this is our land, we'll charge you much lower rent. And so they made a coalition. And it's proof that race was not destiny. There were coalitions between Native people and white people against other white people, in this case, landlords. And so the Wappingers fought on the American side in the war, but I'm very sad to say that Daniel Nimham and his son were both killed in an ambush in August 1778, just north of New York City. One of the few cases where natives were the ones ambushed by non-natives, a group of loyalists and Hessian or Russian or German soldiers. So they were sympathetic to the American side, and some of you may recognize on the map on the left that that's South Carolina. And I'll zoom in on my next slide on one part of South Carolina. So dead at the center of my map is where those of you who are attending in person are in the Catawba Nation. The original agreement, and of course their territory has been massively shrunk down, is still being disputed as we read in the newspapers today. But this is a map from the time of the Revolution, and people recognized it. The Catawbas were another of those groups who sided with the rebels against as the British called them, against the British. But I think we all know, the larger number of natives who sided, who fought in the war at all, fought on the British side. Although a better way to put it, actually, I'll go back to my South Carolina map for this because they're on it. the Cherokees went to war against the United States, the newly independent United States, right after the Declaration of Independence. And you see the most racist line in the Declaration of Independence is he has excited cruel war against us, setting upon our frontiers the merciless Indian savages. And it is true that the natives, after being provoked by murders of some of them by whites, did attack South Carolina in 1776. And the colonists, as you can tell from that line, blamed the British and portrayed Cherokees and other indigenous people as the pawns, almost like the puppets of the British. But the reality of this war in 1776 is it was the Cherokees wanted to go to war against South Carolina, and the British who dragged their feet and said, "Oh, it's not time yet. We'll tell you when it's time to attack." And of course, the Cherokee said, "You won't tell us anything. We'll attack when we want to." And so that is the beginning of the Cherokee War of 1776. The Americans launched massive reprisal raids that August, destroying corn right as it was about to be harvested. And to go to my theme of my work of integrating Native history with non-Native history, it's interesting to note that the first white guy killed in that Cherokee War of 1776 in the advance on Cherokee territory, the first white guy killed was named Francis Salvador, who was also the first Jewish man elected to the legislature anywhere in Europe or America. And so he also became the first white guy to die on the American side. So this is a Cherokee story, but it's also a Jewish history story as well. So that about natives on the American side. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole history behind this story, but this is Burgoyne, who was going to have a bunch of armies meet and march into New York and win the war that way. There actually was no Battle of Saratoga. This is the slide I found online, but there were a couple of battles that led to Burgoyne surrendering at Saratoga. But there's just two Native aspects of this story that I want to mention to you. The first was a decision that Commander-in-Chief Washington made in the summer of 1777 as Burgoyne's army was marching south with Native allies, not as many as he wanted, but he had about 500. And in fact, Burgoyne's army, as he marched south, we think of them the English army, but English were a minority of the people in that army. If you add up all the others, the German soldiers fighting as mercenaries on the English side, Scotch Highlanders, and Native Americans and American loyalists, the majority of those English soldiers invading the United States from Canada, going up Lake Champlain and then over to the Hudson River and down that. The majority of the people in this English army were not English. But that's not my point. My point is that when Washington saw this army headed south, he was most worried about the Native soldiers in it. And so he sent Daniel Morgan's rifle regiment down from this area where in New Jersey, where Washington was. Washington sent Morgan's regiment up there to fight the Native Americans in their own way, that is with rifles. One surprising fact about the Revolution is that most Native Americans who fought in the Revolution had weapons that most of us today would consider better weapons, that is rifles, as opposed to muskets. As the name implies, rifles have a rifle barrel that spin the ball, just like a good quarterback will spin the ball while throwing it. That gives you much better accuracy and distance. Now, they had disadvantages too. They couldn't, you couldn't put a bayonet on the end of a rifle. So muskets had their advantages where you could reload them much faster. But in forest warfare, rifles were better. And that's why Washington was so worried about these Native allies of Burgoyne's with their rifles. And so Washington sent his own riflemen under Morgan. But the most interesting thing about it for me was that Washington's understanding of the psychology of Native Americans was they valued every individual human life in a way that not all British or even American generals did. You know, they were willing to sacrifice a few dozen lives or a few hundred lives if they had to. But natives were not like that, particularly in this war, which was not their war. And so he Washington anticipated that merely sending these riflemen up there, word would get out, and that many of Burgoyne's native allies would abandon him. And that was correct. Actually, some of those native allies of Burgoyne's had already left him. Others did when they found out that Morgan was coming. And but it turned, so most of them were gone by the time Morgan's riflemen got there. But Morgan's riflemen did play a crucial role in these two American victories near Saratoga that led to the British surrender at Saratoga. And so natives played an indirect role there, and they're the reasons that Morgan's men were at Saratoga. And then here they played a much more direct role, the Battle of Oriskany. On the British side, the majority of the fighters were Native Americans. They had an Indian agent named William Butler who was supposedly in charge of them, and another guy who was in charge of the white troops, mostly loyalists there, Tories as this map calls them. But you got to give William Butler credit for understanding they were laying an ambush. As you can see, that's the Brits and Native Americans coming in from the left and to lay an ambush. And they were smart enough on that day in August 1777 to lay an ambush. But they were also smart enough, the white leaders were, to say, you know what, we're just going to let our Seneca allies, the Senecas were the westernmost of the Six Nations of the Iroquois, we're going to let our Seneca allies be our leaders. And they did take the lead in this action. And it's just, to me, an amazing comment that in this 18th century period of extreme racism on the part of whites against Native Americans, when push came to shove and when your life is at stake, you want a good leader. And Butler and his other white counterparts understood the better leaders here were the Senecas. And sure enough, those 400 people on the Native and British side surprised and wiped out Herkimer's column, including Herkimer, who was killed, even though Herkimer had twice as many men. Well, the most important thing I want to say about the war, Native Americans and participation in the war, was just how successful it was in the West. This map is from my book and depicts a scene that hadn't really been described before, and that is in 1780, the British and their allies, Native allies, launched a massive attack against not only white settlements like those you see on the map near Pittsburgh or in Kentucky, but also Native Americans who were allied with the United States. Like I've mentioned a couple of them, but there were a couple more out here, and also against the Spanish. The Spanish were indirect allies of the colonists, that is, of the rebel colonists. Spain was in alliance with France, and France was in alliance with the rebel United States. But in 1780, the British intended to do this massive multi-pronged attack. The southernmost prong never got off the ground. In fact, the opposite of what this map indicates is what actually happened. The British had hoped to start off in Pensacola, hit New Orleans. Instead, the Brits came in 1780 to Mobile, and then 1781 to Pensacola. I'm sorry, the Spanish came from New Orleans first to Mobile and then over to Pensacola, but that was the prong that didn't work. The other prongs all were pretty successful, getting into Western New York, Pennsylvania, Kentucky, Vincennes on the Wabash River. And the most interesting here is sort of a two-pronged attack within the prong, some hitting the Spanish city of St. Louis and others hitting Cahokia. We all know Cahokia from the ancient mounds there, but there was a successor civilization there, and the Cahokia Indians had allied with the United States. And so they really threw the Americans back on their heels in 1780 in particular, but throughout the war. The real objective for the United States throughout the war in the West was Detroit. And you can kind of see why, as you see all these arrows originating in Detroit. That was not only British headquarters, but it was Native headquarters too. It's the armory, because Native Americans, like most white Americans, didn't have the technology to manufacture guns and ammunition, so they had to get that from Detroit, just as the Brits had to get it from England, and the Americans had to get it from their allies in France. So the colonists figured, okay, Detroit is the armory of the Native Americans. If we can hit Detroit, we can starve them, literally, and also starve them of ammunition. And so there's this amazing fact that General Washington and Thomas Jefferson as commander-in-chief of, Thomas Jefferson as governor of Virginia, and 10 other American leaders came up with plans during the war to send expeditions against Detroit. And so there were about a dozen of these plans to hit Detroit. And what I can tell you is none of these 12 American expeditions against Detroit got anywhere near the place because of those same native warriors who were armed there. They prevented any of these expeditions. George Rogers Clark had a couple, didn't get anywhere near. There were many others, Continental troops included, who tried to get there, and they were all thwarted by the natives who realized how crucial Detroit was to arming them. And so I'm really thrilled to see Colin Calloway on this call, as well as Chris and some other people who I hope will speak to this question. But I think it's kind of a consensus that there's a real sense in which Native Americans won the war, the Revolutionary War in the West. In the crucial Western theater, it was the Native Americans who won. That's what happened on the ground. Here's what happened in the peace treaties in Paris, that Native Americans were not represented there, so they just divided it up appropriately, making their territory that now is going to belong to the United States white. The Spanish got everything west of the Mississippi, and also the 2 Floridas, as there were there. It was a little disputed area. The British, of course, kept Canada, and this is a classic example of those maps that you still sometimes see in textbooks. Native Americans are just not part of the story. But the key thing I want to say about this map is that just as the peacemakers, British, French, Spanish, and U.S., just as the peacemakers over in Paris ignored the Indians, Native Americans ignored the peacemakers as well. That is, they didn't go along with these lines. In fact, you wouldn't see anything close to this line, to this removal of Native Americans past the Mississippi River, until well into the 19th century. And of course, many Native Americans are still there today, but they didn't sign treaties giving up their territory, all of this territory, until well into the 19th century. And so I just want to mention very briefly some of that resistance and some of its consequences. You remember my saying that Native Americans had been trying, starting in 1769, especially, to revive the Pontiac Coalition and go across the Ohio River and include Southern nations in resisting the British colonists. They continued to resist and to build that coalition during the war. And the British were kind of the leaders of the coalition of the war. Natives were happy to have them lead because they were more willing to officially be led by these not so powerful British than to submit themselves to some other native nation that they may have been rivals of. So the British had really led the Native coalition during the war, but as the British leave, Native leaders emerged to take over this coalition. And here's one indication of the success of this coalition. It was headquartered at Kekianga, which is now Fort Wayne, Indiana, right about where my arrow is on the map right here. I've got another map that's better marked. You see there's Toledo, Ohio, there's Fort Wayne, and really the same spot was Kekianga at the head of the Maumee River, the headquarters of this coalition. And how successful were they? Well, according to the people who wrote the U.S. Constitution, one of the reasons they wrote that Constitution, there it is in the preamble, was to provide for the common defense. But if you'll watch where I've highlighted the word defense there, I think I'm going to make it more accurate by amending the Constitution to say offense. And here's why I say that. One of the most important, 2 or 3 most important changes the Constitution made was that it gave the federal government taxing authority for the first time ever. And what did they do with that money that they were, one of the first things Congress did once the Constitution was adopted? Congress adopted taxes, mostly port taxes. But what did they do with that money? Well, the single biggest thing they did was spend money paying off the war debt. But if you look at the operating expenditures of the federal government, this is the most amazing statistic I'll give you, and one of the most amazing statistics of American history, in my opinion. In its first 6 years of operation, from 1790 to 1796, 5 out of every $6 that the American government spent was spent fighting Native Americans, that is, being the violent arm of westward expansion. And that's why, if we go back to the motives of the Constitution, I think it's more accurate to say they weren't providing for the common defense, but the common offense. And so you can see I've kind of turned the old Iroquois influence thesis on its head. Many people believe that the Iroquois Confederacy was a model for the United States Constitution. And I think there's a different confederacy that included Iroquois that did influence the Constitution, but in a different way. That is, the United States was worried about dealing with this Native coalition, and so it built up its own coalition. That is, it took the Articles of Confederation and turned it into a nation powerful enough to have its own taxes and field its own army. So this is less an example of, this is a way in which Native Americans influenced the adoption of the Constitution, but not copying the structure of it, but feeling the need to build up a powerful enough nation to deal with Native Americans. And I'm almost at time, or I am at time, so I'm going to skip over some of the ways in which they dealt with them very briefly, but just to say how unsuccessful they were at first. Josiah Harmer sent west in 1790 and sent home, having had lost something like 200 men. And then Arthur St. Clair in 1791 attempted the same thing. He didn't even make it to Kekianga before being turned back and losing more than 600 men. That's twice as many. Everybody's heard of Custer Little Bighorn, but Arthur St. Clair lost more than twice as many people on the morning of November 4th, 1791. So even with Congress now able to tax people, build up a big army, and send out more than 1,000 soldiers in all these cases, it took 3 tries before Anthony Wayne did defeat Native Americans in what's now Toledo, the Battle of Fallen Timbers. But I really think the impact of that battle has been exaggerated. British observers said he only killed about 30 Native Americans, about the same number that he himself lost. What was really significant about Fallen Timbers was that the British had a fort right there called Fort Miamis, could have helped the Native Americans, or at least given them refuge after they were defeated there, sent into retreat there, and the British didn't help the Native Americans. They closed the doors of Fort Miamis to the Native warriors. And I think that, more than anything, is what really convinced the natives to agree the following year in this town, which I'll circle, or it was a fort at the time, Fort Greenville, to the Treaty of Greenville, where they surrendered all of this land. So all except the northwestern corner of what's now Ohio, that is where natives lost it at the Treaty of Greenville. And I think they lost it not because of their defeat at Fallen Timbers so much as the fact that they had been abandoned by the British, and without them supplying guns and ammunition, it was over for them. So let me stop there by saying that I almost want to say sometimes that Native Americans, and this would be true of African Americans too, were able to influence everyone's fate except their own. I don't think anybody suffered more as a group resulting from the American Revolution than Native Americans did. It cleared away the Proclamation line, and it took a long time because Native people continued to resist even without British help. But they are clearly the people who suffered the most as a result of the revolution. And I think that's the thing we most need to commemorate and understand. On the other hand, we should also not see them as mere victims of the revolution, because they were powerfully influencing it all the way through, from helping create a couple of the colonists' biggest grievances against the British restriction on westward expansion and British taxes. both had Native roots, and Native Americans, as you saw, really won the war in the West. So yes, they're the worst sufferers of the revolution, but I wouldn't call them the worst victims. I wouldn't call them victims at all, because they were powerfully influencing the course of events. So I'll stop there and hope that some of you have questions or corrections, since some of you are much bigger specialists in this field than I am, or other things you want to say. So Chris, can you hear me? And do you want to call on somebody to ask a question?
Absolutely. I'm here. Professor Holton, thank you so much for a wonderful, I was going to call it a lecture, but it was more like a conversation. And showing us a side of American history and the American Revolution that we do not read about in traditional histories. And so I appreciate that. If anybody in the audience has a question, if you'll type it into the chat, I'll read it, and we'll let Dr. Holton give you an answer to that question. And while we're waiting for those, I want to give a shout out to Ashley Larimore and Katie Shaw on our staff here. They're behind the scenes on all these lunch and learns, making sure these things run smoothly. And when they don't run smoothly, it's not their fault, but they're behind there trying to make sure that everything does run smoothly and get back on track when we occasionally do fall off. And
we didn't fall off, so thank you guys.
Yeah. And yeah, so and Woody, we had about 50 people come in by Zoom, and we had at least 25 in the gallery today listening in. Let's see, we got one. Upper Sandusky is about 30 miles east on the map on the Sandusky River, now called Fremont, Ohio.
Yes, and that was another of the centers of Native resistance. One of those attacks against Detroit that I mentioned originated in Pittsburgh, and was aimed at Upper Sandusky. And so their sort of more ambitious plan was they would go down the river, the Sandusky River, to Lower Sandusky, and then hit over to Detroit. And they didn't get anywhere near any of that. That's the one where George Washington's surveyor, William Clark, was captured by Native Americans. And this is what used to really feature prominently in the books about the revolution. And I think it deserves to still be there. It's an important part of it, but they tortured him to death very slowly. And they did it for a particular reason. That was in 1782. Earlier in 1782, a group of Delawares who had converted to the Moravian Christian faith had been, and this was men, women, and children, had been massacred when they went back to harvest their fields in southern Ohio. And even though the people fighting William Clark's expedition, they were Delawares who were by no means Christians. They were furious at the Christians and at war with the Christians, but they were so upset at the slaughter of their own people that's why William Clark was dispatched so slowly. Even though he had not participated in that earlier expedition, he represented the same people. But do you have a question related to that, or was he just helping get Upper Sandusky on the map?
I think they were trying to get it on the map. Okay, we got another one. This is
Caroline Sloat. Hi, Caroline Sloat. I can't see you. Or if any of those people are able to, thank you, Colin. Of course, it's William Crawford. I knew something was wrong with that. Colin Calloway corrected me. It's William Crawford was Washington's surveyor and the man in 1782 leading that expedition against Upper Sandusky and captured and killed. Hi, Caroline Sloat. Anyway, if anybody else wants to, I know people are in their bathrobes or whatever. Oh, there you are. Hi, Caroline. Are you in Worcester? Yeah, okay.
All right, we got another. This is a comment and an accolade. Hi, I'm a member of the Choctaw Nation. I live in South Carolina now, and I appreciate your information. I give monthly discussions at the Daughters of the American Revolution for Native Americans, and I will present this information. Thank you for honoring all Native Americans and our contributions.
Thank you very much. I have tremendous respect for the Choctaw Nation for many reasons. The most recent, I did an article about, you would never guess which was the first of the 50 states to pass a law allowing married women to own property. You know that under English common law, the second you get married, Caroline Sloat, you could be a millionaire. And the day you get married, Mr. Sloat owns it all. That was English common law, but that wasn't Choctaw law, and it wasn't French and Spanish law either. And so the answer to that, you'd think a lot of people think the first state to allow women to own property was New York. They did pass a married women's property law in 1848, the same year as the Seneca Falls Convention. But Caroline, do you know what the first state to allow women to own property? I can tell by your face that you don't.
New Jersey, I think.
What's that?
New Jersey?
It was Mississippi.
Mississippi. Oh, wow.
I know. And I say that to my Worcester friend, my Massachusetts friend as a Southerner. We have a little bit to be proud of. And Mississippi became the first state to do that. They didn't do it for the best of reasons. The fact that Choctaw women could own land was interfering with white Mississippians, inveigling them out of their land or attempting to do so. And so part of the reason that Mississippi recognized that women could own land was that. There were also other reasons. It was right after the Panic of 1837, a big financial crisis, and they wanted to allow men to park some of their property behind their wives so their creditors could get to it. Anyway, I didn't mean to go off on that, but I got to learn a lot more about Choctaw law during that period, and it was cool to see that the Mississippi recognized Choctaw law to some extent. Go ahead.
All right, next up, we have a question. You mentioned that there is evidence that the Native Americans may have been responsible for the use of the word red in reference to themselves, but that was according to white people's records. Can you say more about that?
Well, that is a very good point. And I'm going to ask Colin, if you're still there, I'm spacing the name of the professor at University of Connecticut who wrote this amazing article and then book. Will you take
It's
that?
Nancy Shoemaker.
Sure, Nancy Shoemaker. Sorry, I spaced that. I would love to send her article because I was very persuaded. But I'm going to come to your point because I think it's a good one. But Nancy's point is that we have the French on. I'm sorry if I do this backwards for you guys. We have the English on the Atlantic coast, and we have the French on the Mississippi River, and in between them are primarily Choctaws, Chickasaw, Creeks or Muskogees and Cherokees, and then also the Petite Nation, who my map left out. But my point is that you have both English observers on one side writing in English, and French observers writing in French on the other side, noticing Native people referring to themselves as the red people. Now, your point is well taken that yes, there are these two very different sources, but they are both white sources. And so it is possible that they messed that up, just as the line that I quoted about be always united, you who are of one color, or people referring to themselves, natives referring to themselves as the red people. That's all being filtered through written sources. But if that person who raised that issue will get me their email address, I'll email you Nancy's article. I think it's called "How Indians Got to Be Red," because I found it very persuasive. Because for instance, she talked about, I'm from the South myself, and particularly my wife is from the Deep South, and that red clay, if you put that on you, or and a lot of people had other red dyes, then you could see why people would be red, and individuals would start to refer to themselves. The logic she followed was that it was individual groups. Groups of Native Americans refer to themselves as the red people. Maybe we're the red people and you're the black people, not referring to African Americans, but because they're wearing black dye when they go into battle or something. And then it got generalized. So you had two kinds of sources, and you had a logic to it that was persuasive to me. And I'll send it to you and see what you think. But what you say about sources is certainly true. I'd love to hear anybody else's. I'm seeing lots of experts on this topic around, so maybe somebody else will want to.
We did get a comment. The Choctaw woman who commented earlier said, I can comment from the origin story. We are red because we were born of the red clay of the earth from the cave near the from a mound that I'm not even going to try to pronounce the name.
Yeah, and it is red clay, and so it is nice to have you provide some support for Nancy's theory. Yeah, I know. Colin had a previous thing he had to do, so he's left us. So I'm not going to get. I'm going to email him his opinion about Nancy's thesis, but I'd love it if some of the rest of you guys would opine on that thesis. But I really appreciate that contribution from
Dr. Evan Noe, who's the historian here at Native American Studies Center, says the Natchez Indians were also influential in referring to themselves and indigenous people as red.
Yeah. Although, again, in defense of the person who asked the question, according to some of this may be according to written sources, but Kimberly Mason, if you're commenting from family tradition, that gives us a much better, or at least it gives. I'm not opposed to written sources, but I'm not wedded to them. And so if we've got some family history sources that jibe with the written sources, that would help. Thank you for that.
Okay, we got another question. Can you say something about Jefferson's decision to slash the military budget so deeply in his first term? He also sought to cut taxes. It is usually supposed to be to help pay down the debt quicker than the Hamilton plan, but it would seem to counter to your point about the power of taxation for carrying on war against the native nations on the frontier.
It would seem to the period that I was talking about, 1790 to 1796, and the United States was really focused on the region north of the Ohio River and defeating those natives. The war in the South was mostly, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but mostly left to the states, and that is to state militiamen, and that's sort of consistent with Jefferson's states' rights philosophy, that they didn't want federal help because when you got federal help, you ended up with a federal treaty that might respect native rights. And so in general, and somebody can correct this generalization too, because I'm not a scholar of the 19th century, but in general, those 19th century white Southerners were happy to pay for the war so that they could then have the spoils. So yes, you can cut the federal budget while increasing the budget by states like Georgia, and then later Alabama and Mississippi as they take over the war. But since you mentioned Jefferson, I want to say one other thing about him is he was famous for saying that most Americans could go for days without seeing any representative of the federal government, other than maybe the local postmaster. That was the only federal influence in people's lives. And I think that's true for most white people, but it's not true for Native people or African-American people, because despite all that states' rights ideology that I just referred to, what's the first thing that a white governor didn't happen during Jefferson's term, but did during many other white governors' terms, whenever they get a slave revolt? Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831, or shortly after Jefferson was governor of Virginia, 1800, Gabriel's rebellion, 1822, Denmark Vesey, or most famously John Brown's slave rebellion of 1859, or trying to start a slave rebellion. They all called in the feds, federal troops to help them put down rebellions. And so native U.S. troops were used to put down slave rebellions, and of course, as we all famously know, to fight Native Americans. And so the United States government was only libertarian, that is only hands-off in its relation to white people. It was aggressively, violently, and you could even use a word like fascist against Native people and African people. They saw a lot more feds than the postmaster.
All right, let's see. Can you say more about the female war chiefs and peace chiefs and how they work together? Are there many details about the meeting at the collective green corn ceremony?
There are very few details. David, if you'll email me, I'll send you some sites of people. I've seen to remember an author named Trowbridge who wrote a lot about them in the 19th century based on interviewing Native people. So I think he's a white guy writing it down, but he had some decent sources. There's not a ton about them. A few scholars have written about the green corn. You didn't ask about the green corn ceremony or busk, but there are some sources on them. And most people, if you read Theda Purdue on the Cherokees or Daniel Richter writing about the Iroquois, and you can see I'm dating myself because these are the people that I read in graduate school. And I think Collins' books, I know Collins' books also talk about Native women leaders. Just about any time you get a book about any Native society, certainly east of the Mississippi, I'm not well versed on those west of the river, but it's something you can't escape if you're writing about a Native society east of the river. Oh, and I will tell you, this is it doesn't go exactly to your question, but a scholar named Sally Wagner wrote an amazing article, which unfortunately was published in a book that was kind of obscure and didn't get around that much. But you can get a version of Sally Wagner's article online, and it's called "The Iroquois Influence on Women's Rights." And so again, I referred to the many people's belief, which I don't really share. We could get into that debate, but I'm interested in about the Iroquois influence on the Constitution. But Sally Wagner said, forget about that. I'll show you a real Iroquois influence, and that is on the women of Seneca Falls. Everybody knows the first women's rights convention was in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848. And you can tell by the name that's in upstate New York, the area that had been and is still very much Iroquois territory. There's still a lot of Iroquois people there. And her point was that people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who'd been ceremonially adopted by an Iroquois nation, I can't remember which one, these women seeking the right to own property, although they were married, seeking the vote, which they wouldn't get, as you all know, nationwide until 1920, and seeking divorce rights, the right to keep property after divorce, all these rights that white women did not have. Most Native women, I always want to say most because they're a very diverse group, that so diverse that you shouldn't call them a group, but most Native women still, after getting married, had all of those rights, property rights, political power, like we've been talking about, and so forth. And so it was amazing to see in the 19th century, which is an even more racist century than the 18th century, when, that's when that phrase was used, the only good Indian is a dead Indian. That's one extreme of the spectrum of white attitudes. At the opposite end of that spectrum were white Americans, specifically women seeking women's rights, who could see the example of Native women and said, they have what we want. And they even, this is a very Christian era for most white Americans, but they even critiqued Christianity, which they saw as a patriarchal religion, at least as practiced by the men in their lives, and of course saw all of these Native religions that were not at all patriarchal. If anything, they were matriarchal, with a belief in sky woman coming down from above and so forth. Many different variations.
All right, we've got a couple more. Do you have a perspective on Thomas Brown, Dragon Canoe, and the danger of Cherokee/Chickamauga and Creeks had on the progress of the war in the Southern theater, specifically on the requirement of Patriot militia to stay west rather than operate against the British in the Eastern colonies?
Oh yeah, I see what Timothy is getting at there, and it's a great point that I didn't make, and I'm glad you did. I mean, I was focused on the war in the West and saying that most of us historians think the natives won the war in the West. All that's true, but by doing so well in the West, natives tied down militia, as Timothy mentions, but also the Continental Army. The Washington sent a third of his army west in 1779 to attack the Iroquois, and they didn't kill many Iroquois in that attack because the Iroquois were faster than them and got away, but they did burn their fields, forced the Iroquois to depend on Fort Niagara for food, and that's crappy food. And a lot of people then died of malnutrition and exposure during that terrible winter of 1779-80. And so Native people suffered everywhere, but it is true that the process of sending militia west to fight people like Dragon Canoe and the other Chickamaugas, and sending Continental troops west to fight the Iroquois, that really messed up Washington's plans for winning the war. And I think it's probably fair to say is had there been no Native Americans, I mean, it's hard to imagine the United States creating because they were so dependent on the Native Americans for so much for so long. But had there been no Native Americans in 1776, I think it's probably fair to say, the Stamp Act wouldn't have been adopted, the proclamation line wouldn't have adopted, so we probably wouldn't have had a war. But even if we had had a war, the colonists might have won it much sooner, because Tim is correct that the Native Americans tied down so many militiamen and they made them not available to go fight. And it's not just when they were off attacking Native Americans, they were worried about their own homes being attacked. We always think about draft dodgers and draft resistance in the Vietnam War. There was massive draft resistance in the Revolutionary War. The best book about that is by my friend Mike McDonald. It's focused on Virginia, but there was draft resistance in every state. And one reason people, especially in the West, resisted being drafted in the Continental Army or even into a militia unit going off for a few months was they wanted to stay home and protect their families, understandably. So yeah, I think that's a great point I should have made. And next time I give this lecture, Timothy, I'll say this business of tying down would-be fighters against the Americans, that was really significant.
It looks like we have a series of references that have been contributed from our audience. The Choctaw Origin Myth is online, apparently. Susan Sleeper Smith's recent book might be helpful. Greg O'Brien of the University of North Carolina has some great information approved by Native tribes. And then a series of accolades, interesting, and thank you, very interesting coming. And I think that's all of the questions from out in cyberspace. Did we have any questions from the audience here at the Native American Studies Center? I think Katie was going to pop those in if there were any.
Meanwhile, I appreciate all the comments, and I found a way to copy those comments into my computers because there's some references there that are going to be really useful to me. So thank you. For instance, I didn't know Fremont, Ohio is Upper Sandusky. So thank you.
But absolutely, that was a series of really great, detailed questions. Apparently, people were listening and absorbing and thinking about what you had to say today.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, but I'm ready for those other questions anytime.
It doesn't look like there are any. Let's see. Nope, no questions from the studio audience here at the center. I just got a text message. Well, listen, everyone out there, thanks for joining us today for this great lecture on Native Americans and the American Revolution, and wish everyone a happy holidays. And we've got a robust series of programs starting in January, and you hope you'll come back and see these. And as always, these will be posted to our YouTube channel, where you can find not only the Lunch and Learns, but many of the programs that we've been doing here in the last few years. If there's a positive silver lining to COVID, it's the fact that we did go online and begin to put these things on YouTube. So Woody, thanks a million. Warm wishes to you and your family.
Okay, and I'm going to see you in Lancaster before long.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, sir. All right. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate the interesting questions and other information, especially about the Choctaws. Thank you.